What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Jaime Munguia, 37 wins and 0 losses, taking on Gabriel Rosado, 26 wins, 13 losses, 1 draw, and 1 no contest. Now, on its surface, this fight appears to be A-side fighter Jaime Munguia basically taking on a name, Gabriel Rosado, who you can tell by the loss column on Rosado's record that he's not some prized property of one of these promoters who's been protected and somebody who they've been working up carefully. In fact, Gabriel Rosado didn't start boxing until he was like 18 years old. And so he actually had a pretty steep learning curve and took a lot of losses pretty early in his career. But if you look at the career trajectory and the skill trajectory of Gabriel Rosado, this fight might actually become more competitive than it appears on the surface. Jaime Munguia, I first saw against Saddam Ali, and Saddam Ali had just retired Hall of Famer Miguel Cotto. It was Cotto's final fight. Saddam Ali was pretty much a 147 fighter for most of his career, but then he started flirting up at 154, had a couple decent wins, and then he beats Miguel Cotto, who was also pretty much fighting above his natural weight classes later on in his career. Cotto was normally a 140, then 147 guy. It wasn't until later that he started messing around at 154 and then even 160. Now, Saddam Ali, came in against Munguia, and as soon as the fight started, in the opening round, you could tell the size difference between these guys because this fight was at 154. Now, this Munguia-Rosado fight that I'm previewing here is up at 160, but Munguia was at 154, and Saddam Ali, again, normally a 147 guy, was fighting at 154. So you had a small 154 against a big 154, and Saddam Ali just didn't have any answers for the punching power, the aggression, the length of Jaime Munguia. Munguia ended up finishing Saddam Ali by the 4th round. So this was like a shocking coming out party for, I think, then 21-year-old Jaime Munguia. Now he's like 24, but he was super young, beats the veteran, former champion. I mean, this fight was for the WBO light middleweight title. So Saddam Ali was actually a belt holder at this time. Jaime Munguia beats him, takes the title, and then defends it like 4 times. And his reputation is growing with Golden Boy Promotions. I would say he's one of Golden Boy's like 4 best fighters on their roster, any division. And, a couple of those title defenses were against quality fighters. Liam Smith was one of them. He beat Dennis Hogan on paper, but for anybody who watched that fight, Jaime Munguia was pretty much gifted the decision against Dennis Hogan, who I thought pretty much outboxed him and kind of sweet scienced ring generalship, worked behind the jab, was quicker, defensively responsible, and Jaime Munguia wasn't really splashing with the power punches against Hogan the way that he was used to against other opponents. Now, Dennis Hogan has since, messed around at 160 against the likes of Jamal Charlo, basically people significantly bigger than him, where they kind of blew him out of the pocket. And, Dennis Hogan, after this controversial decision loss against Munguia, hasn't looked as impressive going forward. In fact, Hogan was even stopped by rising star right now, Tim Tszyu. But this fight against Munguia was pretty much Hogan's best showing that I've seen. And so Munguia kind of got lucky, got away with one there, earned a majority decision win. And then he had one more title defense at 154. Then he goes up to 160, where his debut was against, tough guy who loses against elite fighters, Gary O'Sullivan. Munguia, again, is looking like a powerhouse terror. I mean, in terms of his punching power and, again, his reach, which is interesting. Neither Wikipedia nor BoxRec have his official reach. Just looking at him, I would think it's at least 72, 73 inches. Gabe Rosado is about a 71-inch reach. But Munguia, long fighter, 6 feet tall, was a beast at 154. I'm a little less sure about what he could do against the elite guys at 160, but so far he hasn't really been tested against the best that the division has to offer. So he beat Gary O'Sullivan in his 160 debut, and then he fights Terriano Johnson, who I thought was given about as good as he was receiving. Like, this was kind of a back and forth fight. Munguia was a heavy favorite against Toriano Johnson, who himself has fought some quality fighters. Well, again, this was pretty much tit for tat. They were exchanging power punches. Munguia is by no means a great defensive fighter, which a lot of people are pretty much spotting early as a red flag in Munguia's game. He gets hit too much. His offense is terrorizing, again, blistering, punching power, pretty good speed too. But he fights kind of recklessly where his chin is pretty up. He doesn't show a lot of head movement. He has been improving his jab, high and low. He'll jab to the body, jab high, kind of set up his power punches a little bit more sophisticatedly as his career has gone on over the past couple years. But he still doesn't show a ton of head movement, so he's kind of a statue, and he's getting hit against Toriano Johnson. Well, Jaime Munguia, again, punching power, true punching power, will get you out of a lot of issues. And it did save him again in this case because he opened up a terrible cut. They ended up stopping the fight in the 6th. And again, what was appearing to be a very competitive and interesting fight, Munguia was able to save the day with his power, stops Johnson in the 6th, and then he has one more fight in the COVID era. Well, actually, this Toriano Johnson fight beforehand was in October 2020, so that was COVID era. But he fights Cesar Ameta, who was coming off of a stoppage loss against Triple G, Gennady Golovkin, the former longtime middleweight champion who, controversially lost his belts in the second fight against Canelo Alvarez. But Triple G didn't look like prime vintage Triple G, but he pretty much dominated every round against Cesar Ameta. It was just a question of how long can Cesar Ameta keep on taking these power punches from Triple G. Well, he lasted a while into the late rounds against Golovkin, but Cesar Ameta, for some reason against Munguia, another power puncher, still insisted on just hanging around in the pocket and exchanging power punches. Well, that didn't last too long. Yes, he was able to hit Munguia, but Cesar Ameta's punching power is nowhere near Munguia's, so Munguia pretty much stopped him by the 6th round. And that is Munguia's last fight to date. And that was only a few months ago. This is Juneteenth, June 2021. Now we're in November, and he's about to fight Gabriel Rosado, who is about as battle-tested as they come. Now, again, you look at this guy's loss column, you're like, why is Munguia fighting Gabriel Rosado pretty much seen as a step-up opponent for Munguia when the guy has like half as many losses as he has wins? Again, 26 wins, 13 losses. Well, again, when you factor in the fact that he is starting his career late, like 18 years old, he's about as tough as they come. Philly born and bred, Puerto Rican fighter. And, after he pretty much started picking up some wins earlier in his career after losing to one of his early losses was actually against Derek Ennis. That is the dad, the father of Jaron Boots Ennis. So this was in 2010. About a year prior to that, Rosado was stopped by Alfredo Angulo when he was still a surging fighter. Angulo at one point was a very dangerous fighter who had lost like a pretty early fight against Kermit Cintron, then went on a run where he beat another top-ish ranked fighter, Joel Julio, big win for Angulo, and then Angulo got knocked out in the 6th round against prime James Kirkland. And then a couple, years later, a couple fights later, he got stopped by Erislandy Lara and then Canelo Alvarez. And then the wheels pretty much came off of Angulo's career. But when he was still, a highly regarded top-notch fighter, he beat Gabriel Rosado. Well, after those early losses against, we'll call him Father Ennis and Alfredo Angulo, Rosado went on a pretty good run. He beat Jesus Soto Caras, even though Soto Caras was better at 147 than he was at 154. This is pretty much towards the end of Soto Caras' career, but that was a big win for Gabriel Rosado. He won another couple, and then he fights Triple G, Gennady Golovkin, when Gennady Golovkin was just starting to, he had been champion already for a while, but he was just starting to headline HBO fight cards, not pay-per-view, but just regular HBO fight cards. Gennady Golovkin was really making his presence felt in the boxing landscape. Gabriel Rosado challenges Triple G at Madison Square Garden for Triple G's WBA middleweight title, and this was a brutal fight to watch. I mean, he was pretty competitive in the first couple rounds, but Gennady Golovkin was such a terror at this time. And he's a sophisticated boxer puncher who he was pretty much, along with Sergey Kovalev, probably one of the top 2 hardest punchers in the sport, any division. And Gabriel Rosado, unfortunately, had to feel the wrath of prime Triple G, to where Gabriel Rosado's head trainer, Billy Briscoe, by the way, one of the more animated trainers in the game, check that dude out, but his longtime trainer, Billy Briscoe, was basically pleading with Gabriel Rosado's dad, like, no, I gotta throw in the towel, man. He's gonna die out there, man. He's gonna die out there. And then, you know, they call off the fight when Gabriel Rosado is just taking way too much punishment, more punishment than he needed to take. You know, to be honest, this fight was 2013. After seeing Rosado get beaten down at the hands of Triple G in the way that he did, I kind of thought that his career was going to be cut short. Well, I mean, here we are 8 years later, and he is pretty much as good as ever when you think about him coming off this huge win against Bek Bully Melikuziev. Well, in 2013, it wasn't looking so hot, especially against Triple G. But one thing about Gabriel Rosado is he has never really ducked a fight. He's been willing to take on anybody. He seems to be a pretty high integrity guy, very solid. He's always trying to get better, and he is pretty damn fearless. Now, I gotta say this about Rosado's career. I mean, he has obviously lost a lot of fights, right? Because after Triple G, you know, he fought a fight against Jalen Love, right? He was on the money team on Mayweather Promotions. Jalen Love had won a split decision win, but then he had failed a drug test, so that was turned into a no contest. But for the people watching the fight, it looked like, you know, Rosado had lost the fight. And then he loses his next 3 fights. A TKO loss against Kid Chocolate Peter Quillin, that was for the WBO middleweight title. Peter Quillin was surging undefeated for just about his whole career until he ran into Daniel Jacobs, which is probably Daniel Jacobs' best win of his career. It was a first-round knockout of Kid Chocolate Peter Quillin. Pretty stunning. Peter Quillin's never really been the same. But that was, again, another loss for Rosado. Then he loses his next fight against pretty much rising prospect at the time, Jermell Charlo, the smaller of the 2 Charlo brothers. And this fight was actually at 154. I thought that this was a very competitive fight. Jermell Charlo won via unanimous decision, but Gabriel Rosado conducted himself very well, I thought, in that fight. And then his next fight was against David Lemieux, who, you know, has been outboxed so cleanly against Billy Joe Saunders and has been stopped by Triple G. But if you're not an elite fighter, David Lemieux has the type of punching power that'll get you the hell out of there. And David Lemieux versus Gabriel Rosado was one of those. I mean, Rosado was durable through most of the fight, ended up getting stopped in the 10th round. And then he actually goes on a 2-fight winning streak. One of those 2 fights was against Joshua Clottey, who really had no business fighting anywhere above 147 himself. Well, then after that 2-fight win streak for Rosado, man, the losses just keep coming. He loses a decision to Willie Monroe Jr., who we've seen, you know, get stopped by Triple G. Then he loses to Martin Murray via majority decision. This was actually a very close fight. I mean, majority decision, but some people thought Gabriel Rosado deserved the win in that one, but Martin Murray was granted the decision. And that's another thing about Rosado's career. Because he hasn't been protected by any promoters, he's never been anybody's golden goose, you know, getting favorable scorecards. He's usually on the losing end of the very close fights. They don't give him the close rounds. And so I've actually seen multiple fights where I, heading into the scorecard, thought Rosado deserved it. The Martin Murray fight was actually one of them. But Martin Murray, like most Gabriel Rosado opponents in close fights, got awarded the decision. Well, then Rosado wins his next fight against Glenn Tapia via TKO, and then he fights a split decision draw versus Luis Arias, who we actually just saw beat Jarrett Hurd in Luis Arias' biggest win to date. I actually think that he's going to have a pretty promising future perhaps over these next couple years. We'll see what he does. But Luis Arias looked pretty good against a very diminished looking Jarrett Hurd. I mean, I always thought Jarrett Hurd got hit too much, but that fight versus Luis Arias was pretty terrible for Hurd. I mean, he was competitive. It was pretty much a slugfest, but I mean, Jarrett Hurd got hit seemingly a lot more and a lot harder than he was dishing out. He needs to retool his game if he wants a future in the sport. Former champion we're talking here, Jarrett Hurd. But Rosado fought a draw versus Arias and then lost against, again, another surging fighter who's seen as a more favored prospect, somebody who they're looking to elevate, Sulecki. Sulecki is a Polish fighter, pretty damn good. I mean, Sulecki's really only lost to Daniel Jacobs via decision and to Demetrius Andrade via decision. And by the way, Andrade I see as being one of the 3 best fighters at middleweight. It's a damn shame that he can't get any of the important fights that matter. He's holding the WBO belt. He can't get any title unification. Jamal Charlo doesn't seem to care to fight him. Triple G's showing no interest in fighting him. I'm like, where is the integrity in the sport when you have a champion who can't fight any of the other champions and has to fight like the Liam Williamses of the sport? Demetrius Andrade has another fight coming up, and it's not against a guy who anybody cares to see him fight. So, you know, Triple G, Jamal Charlo, I mean, these other guys really have to step up right now. But Sulecki, who fought Gabriel Rosado, had only lost to Andrade and Daniel Jacobs, but at the time that he fought Rosado, he only had that one loss to Jacobs. So this was right before he fought Demetrius Andrade. Well, Sulecki, you know, was pretty much too active and outboxed, just cleanly outboxed, and was hitting harder as well against Gabriel Rosado. And Rosado lost via unanimous decision to Sulecki. So again, by this time, Rosado is simply looking like a journeyman, just one of those win some, lose some type of guys. And then he fights Humberto Ochoa. Nobody really, you know, knows too much about him unless you're just like a die hard, you know, fan of the sport. And even then, you probably don't know much about Ochoa. Rosado won that fight via unanimous decision, and then he fights Daniel Jacobs during, we'll call it the COVID era. He fights him November 2020. This is pretty much one of the biggest letdown fights of the year, just in terms of the inactivity, just the lack of fireworks. It was pretty much a snoozer. Going into the scorecards, you know, Jacobs, by the way, was a heavy favorite here. I mean, we've seen Daniel Jacobs, again, knockout Kid Chocolate, fight super competitively with Triple G, fought pretty competitively with Canelo Alvarez. But in this fight against Gabriel Rosado, Daniel Jacobs couldn't seem to get out of first or maybe second gear. Rosado boxed pretty well, seemed to neutralize it was an uninspired effort from Daniel Jacobs, but he just couldn't put his foot on the gas, and it was anybody's guess going into the scorecards who won that fight. And most people were, Daniel Jacobs' stock in this fight against Rosado dropped pretty significantly. I think it dropped more in this fight than it did in Jacobs' loss against Canelo or his loss against Triple G. Because this was such a uneventful showdown against a fighter like Rosado, who most people thought Jacobs should beat pretty convincingly, it wasn't a good look for Jacobs. But again, this is Gabe Rosado we're talking. So heading into the scorecards, some thought Rosado probably might have won that. Some thought maybe Jacobs. Jacobs won the split decision win. So there you go. Just another short end of the stick for Rosado. And then he fights Bektemir Melikuziev, Bek Bully, who was supposed to be fighting, you know, a few months prior against Sergey Kovalev. Kovalev tested positive for PED, so that fight, disappointingly, was canceled. Bektemir Melikuziev had to wait a while before he would get in the ring. Eventually did in June 2021. In fact, this Melikuziev versus Rosado fight was on the Jaime Munguia versus Cesar Romero undercard. And Bek Bully, like a lot of the guys Rosado fights, was the A-side fighter who people were pretty much there to see. Let's see what this new prospect we're trying to elevate, let's see what he's got. Throw him in there against Rosado and find out. If he's good, he beats Rosado. If not, he's probably not that good. That's kind of the idea here. Well, Melikuziev, power puncher, he fights between 168 and 175. So this was definitely seemingly outside of Rosado's depths, who was pretty much a 154, mostly 160 guy, now fighting Bek Bully, heavy hitter, big time prospect at 168. And you could see Rosado trying to set up these counter punches because Bek Bully was trying to bully him, was kind of upright, just throwing hard power punch, 1, 2, 3 punch combinations, not showing too much respect for the return fire coming from Rosado. Well, in the third round, Bek Bully paid for that. Rosado nailed him with a beautiful counter punch, caught him so cleanly in fact, that Bek Bully came down timber, face first, out cold, shocking, upset win for Gabriel Rosado. I felt so happy for Rosado. It just, you've seen the guy fight for so many years, and the guy just deserves for something good to happen in the ring in his career. Now, Rosado's had acting roles. He was in that Creed movie. So he actually has a pretty high profile for somebody who has 13 losses and only 26 wins. But this win against Bek Bully was almost like vindication, like finally a showcase shining moment for Gabriel Rosado, one-punch knockout of the prospect, of the favorite, which then sets up this Jaime Munguia versus Gabriel Rosado showdown. And, you know, thankfully for Rosado, this one is back down to 160, so he's not fighting anybody at 168. So what do I think is going to happen with Munguia versus Rosado? You know, with the holes in Munguia's defense, I mean, he's almost ripe to get drilled by somebody who really knows what they're doing in the ring and is able to set him up and take advantage of his kind of reckless and aggressive fighting style. Now, again, Munguia, I think, has gotten slightly better over time, but not really good enough to where those deficiencies in his game won't cost him at some point. But you know, Rosado, whether you see him fighting against Sulechki or you saw him against Willie Monroe Jr., we've seen him outbox. And then you talk Triple G, David Lemieux, we've seen him outgunned with the power punches. So is he going to be able to expose Munguia? Like a lot of people are kind of waiting for Munguia to get exposed because, again, he's undefeated. But if you look at his quality of opponent, he hasn't been fighting the elite guys. They've been bringing him up kind of carefully. I mean, he's fought a couple pretty decent fighters, but really nobody that damn good, especially up at 160. So, you know, you could argue that Rosado is the best guy that Munguia has faced at 160. I mean, I think he's better than Gary O'Sullivan, Toriano Johnson, and Cesar Romero. I mean, I think, but who knows? One of those three guys, if they got in the ring with Rosado, might actually beat him because, again, a lot of people beat Rosado. But Munguia, I think he's going to get hit. I think it's going to be pretty interesting and exciting for the first few rounds, but I think he's going to blast Rosado early. Like, Rosado got dropped early in the fight against Melikuziev. He might have gotten dropped twice in that fight, in fact. I know he got dropped in the first round, and he got dropped early against Sulechki. So Rosado's vulnerable to getting dropped early in the fights. Munguia's definitely gunning early in the fights. I think there's a high likelihood he hurts Rosado early, but Rosado is so experienced, so pretty dang durable. So I think that he'll make it out of the early rounds. I think he's going to bring it into the middle rounds. But I don't think that this fight's going to hit a point where he stops getting hit hard. I think he's just going to be taking on too much punishment to where Munguia, with his length, with his aggression, with his punching power, and and his accuracy. I mean, there's something to be said for somebody who keeps on bailing themselves out with their power punches. I think that he's just going to put a beating on Rosado, and Rosado's going to be looking to his craft to find opportunities to expose and outbox Munguia and try to set him up for maybe some power punches of his own. I just think that it's more likely that he starts getting blown out of the pocket to where, it starts to be up to, his trainer, the referee, somebody to maybe stop the fight. Because another thing about Rosado is that he cuts a lot, and Munguia cuts people a lot. So I think that Rosado is going to, be bleeding by the third, fourth round. I think he's going to pretty much be a bloody mess by the middle rounds. And I think that he would actually be pretty lucky to make it into, let's say, the 8th and 9th round. He might win a couple rounds. He might even have some moments where it's like, oh, the crafty, experienced Rosado might be having his moments. This might be a turnaround, a turning point of the fight. But I think that Munguia is going to, collect himself, not get into too much danger and is going to be able to, keep on raining power punches over time. Because another thing about Munguia, his punching power carries late. He stopped Gary O'Sullivan in the 11th round. He stopped both Cesar Meta and Johnson, again, in the 6th round. And in this fight, I actually think that he's going to probably stop Rosado. And again, I don't think it's going to be like a knockout loss because Rosado just has too much heart. He's just too tough a guy. I think it's going to be a TKO where somebody has to save Rosado from himself, probably somewhere like in the 9th round. I would say probably at like a 9th, 10th round TKO. Somebody has to come in and wave the fight off in the later rounds, win for Jaime Munguia. But yeah, let me know what you think about Munguia versus Gabriel Rosado in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.